Welcome to Never Again Is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. I'm Evelyn Marcus.
And I'm Phyllis Zimbler-Miller.
In this episode, we will discuss with a former member of the Israeli parliament the wider view of the October 7 war. Ruth Wasserman-Lande is an Israeli politician, diplomat, and activist, as well as a former member of the Knesset. Since October 7, she has been on numerous media shows to discuss Israel's military and diplomatic actions. Ruth, welcome to our show. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for both of you and to the audience as well.
Ruth, if you had only one piece of information about Israel to get across to an international audience right now, what would that be?
The first thing I would say to anybody who's genuinely interested is come and visit and see for yourselves rather than rely on endless disinformation, which is being disseminated throughout the international arena and in international media. The situation is complex. The people of Israel are resilient. And yet full of humanity and a wish to live. We sanctify life rather than our enemies who unfortunately sanctify death. And the one message that I would like you to take home from visiting Israel is to bring back our hostages, which are still being held against international law in Gaza by the very hyenas and terrorist organization Hamas.
So how come there is so much disinformation making it to the social media and the mainstream media, and so little real information coming across?
So I believe that a lot of emphasis has been put by the Israeli government on trying to deal with the current, I don't even know what is the correct word to call it, but the heinous attacks that are being made against the Israeli civilians on a number of occasions. It's not only from the West Bank that people speak of very little, by the way, because many terrorist efforts are being wolfed and watered by the Israeli IDF from the West Bank. We don't hear about it because they don't actually take place. They are being removed by the IDF, but there are many attempts to kill Israeli civilians, and I stress civilians all the time, by bombings, by shootings, by attacks being made on the road, in cars, against civilians, and so on. Also, there are constant attacks being made from the north. And I'm not talking about the Hezbollah. I'm still talking about the Hamas, because there is a Hamas terrorist organization in Lebanon being entrenched there, trained, funded by Iran in Lebanon, as well as the Iranian Shia militias in Syria that are entrenched in Syria, in the north of Israel, that are trying and always attempting to make attacks against civilians in the north of Israel. And that, of course, adds up to the horrible, heinous attacks that were taking place against Israeli civilians until they were stopped by the IDF, and that is on October 7th, including the massacres and I hate to speak about it, but it is necessary, and that is the gang rapes, the killings, the murders, the terrible evil that we could see on October 7th. And that is something that, of course, at the moment is stopped from the south, although the rocket fire has not stopped yet. And the Hamas is saying, as long as we're there, we will continue doing it again and again. All of this is taking place And the Israeli government is putting a lot of effort into that mechanism. Unfortunately, what the Israeli government has not put enough effort into is the issue of explaining the narrative to the international arena. And to answer your question, there is a need, and we are obviously made aware of this because there is a narrative that is being pushed and forwarded by Qatar, which is funding a lot of campuses throughout the US and elsewhere, and by Iran, that is funding demonstrations throughout the world. These are not merely spontaneous demonstrations for the Palestinians, because Muslims are being massacred in Sudan. Muslims are being massacred throughout Africa. Muslims are being massacred in Syria and elsewhere. And yet the only place that demonstrations take place against is Israel and the Palestinians in Gaza, which sort of doesn't make sense and makes one asks the question, who has an interest in instigating this anti-Israeli, anti-Jewish sentiment? And there is proof also of the funding being channeled through Iran, through Qatar, and through other channels, for example, like the Muslim Brotherhood cells that are being created throughout Europe and in the United States. So the West, first of all, should awaken. And I'm not only talking about the intelligence mechanisms throughout the world, but rather the general public, which is, very reliant on very simple messaging, on looking at what the very simple narrative is. And that is, unfortunately, that there is a retaliation by the IDF in Gaza. Yes, there is. And there are few, not the numbers that the Hamas is giving, because the Hamas cannot be relied upon. But there are tragically also civilian casualties in Gaza, which is sad, it's unfortunate, it's tragic, and this is not something that Israel nor the Jewish people are happy with. However, there's a huge difference between what is being put out there in terms of the narrative and the message, and the fact that there is a machine dealing with a narrative being put across, funded by very unfriendly forces towards the West, that is being narrated to the general public and fed to the general public. And that is the most unfortunate thing that I see here.
Yes, and as far as I know, every war includes a war of information, and
Absolutely.
the war of information is not won by Israel. Definitely not. It's won by the other side already for decades. And as we can see every day, politicians are influenced by the public opinion. Public opinion is influenced by everywhere in the world. Public opinion is influenced by media and social media. So I hope Israel will take a bigger effort and let us all know how we can help with that in getting the real narrative across.
I think that this is very important. I think it should be one of the main attempts, of course, alongside the military attempt, which we have no choice, unfortunately, but to strengthen and to continue with, simply to live and to survive the endless attacks on our territory and on our civilians. But yes, indeed, I agree with you that there is a war of information that needs to be fully fledged and maintained, not only during wartime, but in between as well, because it needs to harness the right information and to really channel that information constantly towards the general public. As you say, it influences decision making.
I would like to raise something I've heard you speak in other programs. What do you think is the most overlooked aspect of what is behind Hamas's brutal goals against Israel?
Okay, so I think one of the main issues that most people either don't know or they're unaware of is the fact that there is uh, a strategy behind the entire issue of the October 7th attacks. The October 7th attacks are the tactical outcome at that particular time of a larger strategy run and forwarded by Iran. Iran needs to be well understood. First of all, it's not the greater Iran, including the civilian population of Iran, but rather the Ayatollah or the mullah leadership of that country, the extreme Islamic leadership of that country, which has very clear strategy of taking over not only the region, but the entire world. It almost sounds like a horror film, but this is the strategy. They speak about it in Persian and with Arabic partners in Arabic. Indeed, one needs to understand the extreme Islamic perception and ideology. And this is not only for the Shia mullah entity, but rather the Sunni entities throughout the Middle East and in the world, including the Hamas, the Islamic Jihad, and other entities that have simply an ideology which is an extreme Muslim ideology. The one country that well understands this is Egypt, because it had many, many issues and still has with Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood, which the Hamas is a branch of, is indeed an Islamic extreme ideology that is Sunni, in fact, against Shiites. But when it comes to hating Israel, they join forces. And that ideology is to create a Muslim caliphate throughout the world, to have the Sharia, the Islamic rule of law, take over and not the West. So when we talk about the West is next, this is not just a mantra or a kind of a word game. This is indeed embedded very, very thoroughly in that extreme Islamic ideology, which is something that the Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Shiites in Iran, their own militias in Syria and Iraq, the Hezbollah, which is an arm of Iran, and other groups like the Islamic Jihad and so on, they all share. They want the world to be Islamic extreme, very similarly to what ISIS wanted to accomplish throughout the world. And that is something that the West and its liberal values cannot comprehend, because when we're talking about freedom fighting, equality of rights, some kind of freedom from occupation, and other very liberal values, it has nothing to do with the ideology which is currently trying to embed itself in Israel, in the Middle East, and secondly, in the West, in Europe, and in the United States, Canada, Australia, and so on.
If I could just say what I heard you say in one sentence recently, you said, it's about religion, it's not about land.
It's not about land. It's this is something that is very important for people to understand as well. People are speaking about freedom fighting, about freeing the Gaza Strip from the Hamas, from Israel by the Hamas. Why do they speak about it when on October 6th, the Gaza Strip was empty of Israeli soldiers? In fact, there were not only no Israeli soldiers, there was not one Israeli civilian anywhere near the Gaza Strip. Not only that, but when Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2005, in order to allow the Palestinian Authority, that is the Fatah, not the Hamas, to take over, which is exactly what the United States wants to do right now. The Hamas then took over, but by force, by the way. But what happened is that the Israelis literally dug out the graves of all the Jews inside the Gaza Strip so that there was not even one Israeli or Jewish bone left in the Gaza Strip. So when we speak about freedom fighting or freeing the land from Israeli so-called occupation, there was no Israeli occupation of the Gaza Strip on October 7th, and that didn't stop the Hamas from perpetrating the horrid attack that it did on October 7th. And not only that, it's not about freeing the land. When the instigators, the operatives that perpetrated these heinous crimes were and still are investigated, they speak of killing civilians. They speak of the occupiers when they speak about Israelis. And when they speak about killing and raping and massacring the occupiers, they speak about the kibbutzniks that are and live throughout the Otef Gaza areas in the kibbutzim and the moshavim around that area in Israel proper, not in the Gaza Strip, but on the Israeli side. They view and they're taught and they are incited against the entire Israeli population because they are taught that they are occupiers. The entire state of Israel is indeed viewed by the Hamas and by the teachings of the extreme Muslims as foreign agents that have occupied the land, the entire land, not the West Bank, not Gaza, but the entire Israel. And they say that we, the civilians of Israel proper, have no place here. They are planning to free the entire Israel. And then they don't stop there. They speak of freeing the entire world of disbelievers, of non-believers, of kuffar in Arabic, which are exactly what the Western Christians are for them.
So it is about Islamizing the land, not so much about liberating the land for its former Palestinian inhabitants.
It's not at all about liberating land. It's not about the land. It's about basically freeing the world of non-believers. This is the end of days. This is the final vision in religious terms for the Muslims, the extreme Muslims. And killing or converting disbelievers or non-believers is part of it. This is something that is not spoken about. It's not put across to the general public. This is something that needs to be taken into account. And it's very easy because they don't make a secret out of it. It's not something that is difficult to understand or comprehend. One just needs to listen to the Arabic simple translation, and there it is. It's all out there. There's no making a mistake about it.
When I heard the Israeli spokesperson in the first week after October 7, he said, the IDF spokesperson, he said, what happened on October 7 is against Islam. Is that true?
So very many sheikhs, whether in Israel or elsewhere, that are not of extreme Islamic orientation, have said this is not Islam. You cannot yell Allahu Akbar and gang rape a young woman. That is not the ideology and the values that Islam disseminates and wants people to adhere to. Not about killing, massacring, burning civilians, not about killing children. And that's what they did. That's what they did, yelling and screaming out Allahu Akbar, God is great, while doing all of that. And then religious permits were found on their bodies of killed Hamas operatives by the IDF at a later stage from religious higher sheikhs belonging to the Hamas in the Gaza Strip, allowing them to commit and perpetrate those crimes in the name of that freeing whatever it is that they were told they were freeing, which is the entire state of Israel. And that is, you know, depending on how you adhere to Islam. There are the extreme versions, and there are, of course, the more moderate versions of understanding and interpreting the written Quran. And it depends on whether the sheikh is an extreme Islamic one belonging to a very extreme ideology or not.
I just want to back up with something that Ruth said as an eyewitness. It's ironic that my husband and I were on a mission in southern Israel the weekend in 2005 that all Israeli settlers, etc., were removed by Israel from the Gaza Strip. And we literally were there, I'll never forget it, a coffee stop or something, where young Israeli soldiers were en route to Gaza to help displace the Israeli settlers. It really happened in 2005. It's not just a talking point. My husband and I saw it ourselves. And yet this particular piece of information gets overlooked all the time in the chants about, freeing Gaza from occupation. I know, Ruth, that time is limited. Evelyn may have one more question, and then we do want to give you a chance for anything that you think we really should discuss. Evelyn, do you want one more question?
Yes, but before we go on to that, Ruth, the argument used when you say, but the Israelis left Gaza, is that Israel is closing off Gaza at the sea, and that nothing can get in or out.
Well, one needs to look at it a little bit more deeply. There were 17,000 workers with work permits, Gazan workers, coming into Israel, working in the various, industries and other institutions within Israel. And the irony is that on the weekend prior to Simchat Torah, on which October 7th was taking place, there was a discussion of allowing more workers to come in because the understanding, the very misled and wrong understanding perception on behalf of the IDF was that if one gives livelihood and allows for the economy to be fine in the Gaza Strip, then the Gazans will not be aligned with terrorism and perpetrate terrible things, which of course was a complete misconception. Other than that, another point which I must make, billions of dollars were channeled to the Hamas, some of them in suitcases by the Qataris with Israeli permission, understanding that if the Hamas was the government and it wanted to create sustainable sources of income, industry, employment opportunities, education, and so on in the Gaza Strip, then it should be allowed that money to be able to survive, exist, and so on. What did it do with that money? It says in Arabic, plain and clear in interviews, and that as well needs not rely on my words. One just needs to Google that they don't need to take care of the Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip. There is UNRWA for that. They need to take care of the resistance against Israel and the kuffar, the non-believers. Why? They built hundreds of kilometers of attack tunnels under the Gaza Strip, attack tunnels, weapons, manufacturing of weapons, billions of dollars, not for infrastructure, not for housing, not for education, not for employment opportunities, and not for sustainable sources of income, but for war. So this needs to be taken into account when one speaks about the blockage, the blockade, the fact that no Palestinians could enter. It's simply a lie. It's not true. Now, not only that, but one needs to also understand another thing. UNRWA, which is the only institution by the UN specifically for Palestinian refugees. There are no other refugees on the face of the planet that have their own specific UN body to take care of. So, for example, Sudanese, Afghani, Syrian, and other refugees do not have a specific UN body. They have just one body that oversees all those refugees, but the Palestinian refugees have a specific body taking care of their so-called rehabilitation, and much funding is channeled towards that body. Very important to understand that UNRWA, in the 75 years of its existence since the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, has done zero rehabilitation of those refugees, zero. Not one refugee has been rehabilitated, but miraculously, these are the only refugees that grew in number. Rather than rehabilitating those refugees, which is the purpose of a rehabilitation body of those refugees, to which a lot of money is being channeled, billions of dollars throughout the years, they have actually increased the number of refugees from 600,000 to millions, more than 6 million refugees, granting identification cards to each and every child, grandchild, and great-grandchild of a refugee from 1948. So they have not done their job, plus the money keeps channeling. What does that mean? They're in charge of the education of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, and that education is the key issue. The incitement, the hatred, sanctifying death, and one needs to just look at the textbooks. They don't need to rely on my word. This is clear evidence. There's no even a question about it. There is no way that any child can come out normal when in young age they are being given weapons, they are being taught to shoot, they're being taught to hate, they are being taught to sanctify death in the name of Allah and to kill innocent civilians in Israel and throughout the world, and to hate Jews. They hate Jews. That is what the UN is funding UNRWA to teach. And that's not only in the Gaza Strip. It's in the West Bank. It's in Jordan, led by the Hashemite kingdom, supported by Israel and the US, and is very important to be kept stable against Iran and against other extreme entities, is teaching its population the same thing. This is very unfortunate, and this is something that the world must know. Because if they continue to fund UNRWA, the same thing will happen again and again.
Is there something you can tell us about the last few days of negotiations about bringing the hostages home?
So there are negotiations, but allow me to have a difficulty with the word negotiations, because to negotiate, you need to negotiate with a partner. The partner is not a legitimate partner. The US has a policy of non-negotiation with terrorists. The Hamas is designated as a terrorist organization, not only by Israel. Russia, the Russian Federation, which is telling Israel to cease fire, has a non-negotiation policy with the terrorists. But Israel is unfortunately being asked to negotiate with terrorists because it is holding 134 civilians, women, a child and a baby, the elderly, one of whom is 80 years old. as hostages in horrendous conditions, and that we know from those that have been given back in return for murderers from the Israeli prison. These children and women have been given back and have been telling the media and the world about the horrendous conditions that they were held in. These hostages are in fact being held for over 150 days already, illegally, by a terrorist organization called the Hamas, that has been designated as a terrorist organization by many Western countries throughout the world, not by Israel. And Israel is negotiating, again, in inverted commas, with that horrific entity via Qatar, which is funding that entity and has been funding the leaders of the Hamas, like Ismail Haniyeh, etc., within its own borders in very fancy hotels, while the people of Gaza, the Palestinians, some of them are starving to death and are being held hostage, in fact, by the Hamas, which is stealing the humanitarian aid and or selling it for absolutely unbelievable prices. This is the same humanitarian aid that the world is demanding of Israel to allow to enter the Gaza Strip. The Hamas is stealing, and the leaders of the Hamas are being sitting and sanctuaried by Qatar in fancy hotels, living very, very good, fancy lives in Qatar. Qatar is one of the mediators of the negotiations, as well as Egypt. Why Egypt? Because Egypt has leverage over Sinwar and over the Hamas leaders in the Gaza Strip, because it has the control over the Philadelphia line, the opening, the other opening of the Gaza Strip towards the Sinai Peninsula. The Gaza Strip, in fact, has two openings, one towards Israel and the other towards Egypt, not including the sea. And therefore, Egypt has a lot of leverage as well. So the Qataris have leverage because they've been paying the Hamas leaders that live in Qatar, as well as those in the Gaza Strip. They've been paying them, again, by permission of Israel, with suitcases full of cash for a very long time, which have not been used for the goods and the benefit of the Palestinian people, but rather for the war against Israel and the tunnels, basically, dug by Hamas. And the Egyptians are basically, those are the mediators of the negotiations. And what is currently being asked is for the Hamas to free the hostages, first and foremost, the 19 women still being held by the Hamas that have undergone rape, gang rape, horrendous conditions, and God only knows in what condition they are, because the Hamas will not tell the world in a very illegal manner of their condition, whether they're alive or dead, whether they're healthy or sick, if they are pregnant, the women, or not. They do not tell the world what is their condition. They have negated the demand of Israel to say which hostages are alive or dead. But the idea is of the deal, because Israel is committed to bringing these civilians back home, is to have the women and the elderly and the sick first freed. In response, Israel will free murderers from the Israeli prisons and cease fire for a number of weeks. And then the other prisoners, the men, are supposed to be freed by the Hamas in return for more ceasefire, for the continuation of the ceasefire. Israel has agreed to that, the Hamas has not. Israel has agreed to that, the Hamas has not. And despite the fact that Israel sees these conditions of those negotiations as horrific, completely unfair, Israel is still committed to bringing those civilians back, because that is what a country needs to do when innocent civilians are being dragged out of their beds in their own homes by terrorists. But the Hamas does not agree. And that is where we stand at the moment.
Well, we hope that those hostages will be returned soon. Although, who knows? But we can hope and pray. And is there any, very brief last words you'd like to say before we end this really heartbreaking, compelling interview?
Michelle Obama, when African girls were taken hostage and abducted by Boko Haram, an extreme Islamic organization in Africa, went on a campaign holding signs, "Bring back our girls." The UN organizations and committees on women's rights led very large and intense campaigns on Me Too, against abduction, against rape. When it comes to Jewish women, Israeli women being abducted in an absolutely disgusting, inhumane fashion, where is the world? Where are those women organizations? Where is the UN? When we, the Jewish people, lost 6 million people in the Holocaust, too many people kept silent, and our mantra since then was never again. Thank God for the state of Israel and the Jewish peoplehood for continuously saying that mantra again and again. And I call on those conscionable people throughout the world to come out and say the same thing. This is not God's will. This is a crime against humanity. Not Israel is committing genocide, and not the Palestinians alone, but extreme factors throughout the Islamic world, funded, trained, encouraged by countries that have responsibility and that can be held accountable, that teach hatred, that teach incitement, that disseminate hatred and encourage crimes against humanity, like Qatar, like Iran, like other Muslim countries that teach incitement and need to be made held accountable and change their education systems. And bodies like the UN. The world needs to cry out, because it's not ending there. It's not ending there. If anybody has any question about that, one just needs to learn of that extreme ideology. Very easy to do. They disseminate photos, interviews, information, talks freely. Free, no charge. Just go online, learn. It's all there. We need to join hands in humanity, because at the end of the day, I believe we are all the children of the same God. And it's not God's will to kill, massacre, burn, rape people. This is not something that the IDF nor Israel does. And the lies disseminated about that is once more a crime.
Yes, Ruth, that, as I said, this is such an important interview that we've done. And we hope that our listeners take to heart your encouragement to educate themselves so that they can answer the lies. The bigger the lie, the more people believe it. So we all have to work together to get out the correct narrative. So we thank our listeners for listening. For those of you who want to learn more about Evelyn and myself and our work, go to Never Again Is Now podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And as we said, and every show, but I'm going to add a sentence, we always say, speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate. And I'm adding, bring our hostages home.